In this last section of notes, we're going to be looking at gas exchanges in the body and some disorders of the respiratory system. So let's start just by understanding how exchange of gases occurs. The primary function of the respiratory system is to get oxygen into the body and get the carbon dioxide waste from cellular respiration outside of the body. It depends on diffusion. So we have to remember that things diffuse from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. And you'll see them refer to partial pressure. And basically what you should do is be thinking about what is the concentration of carbon dioxide and just pay attention to that. Where's the highest concentration? Where's the lowest concentration? And then separately think about where's the concentration of oxygen highest. And that will help you be able to determine which direction these things are going to flow. External respiration is where we're getting oxygen into the bloodstream and we're getting carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream and into the air. The exchange of these gases happens between the lung alveoli, those are the little air sacs at the end of the bronchioles, and the blood capillaries. And remember, those air sacs are wrapped in capillaries. The pressure of carbon dioxide, or the concentration of carbon dioxide, is higher in the capillaries than it is in the air. So the carbon dioxide will diffuse from the higher concentration in the bloodstream to the lower concentration in the alveoli, and then into the lungs. The partial pressure pattern for oxygen is the opposite. Higher concentration in the alveoli than the capillaries, so oxygen will diffuse from the alveolar sac into the bloodstream. When you actually look at how this is transported, most of the carbon dioxide is traveling through the bloodstream in the form of bicarbonate. And when it reaches the lungs, we have this carbonic anhydrase, which is an enzyme that helps convert it back into carbon dioxide and water. Oxygen transport goes the opposite direction. As oxygen moves into the bloodstream, hemoglobin inside the red blood cells picks up the oxygen, allowing us to carry significantly more oxygen than we would be able to if it just went from high concentration to low. It actually moves into the bloodstream and then from the plasma into the red blood cells, allowing for it to have a higher capacity of oxygen storage. In this image, you can see sort of how this is occurring. We can see in the lungs, we have these capillaries, and in those capillaries, we'll see that high level of carbon dioxide moving into the alveolar sac, and then the high level of oxygen from the alveolar sac moving into the bloodstream and then into the red blood cells. In a moment, we'll talk about what happens at the body tissues, but we can see that exactly the opposite happens. High concentration of oxygen in the red blood cells, so it will move into the capillaries in the beds of tissue, and the tissue tends to have a higher level of carbon dioxide from cell respiration, and so that carbon dioxide will move from the tissues into the bloodstream. Notice that as we leave the left side of the heart, this travels out to the body, deposits the oxygen, picks up the carbon dioxide, heads back to the right side of the heart, which then pumps blood that is low in oxygen, high in carbon dioxide out to the lungs. And this is where gas exchange is occurring between the air and the lungs. The carbon dioxide is delivered, the oxygen is picked up, and then the blood returns to the left side of the heart where it can be pumped back out to the body. Internal respiration is the exchange of gases between the blood and the tissues of the body. The concentration of oxygen, just like we talked about in the last slide, is higher in the capillaries than in the tissues. So oxygen diffuses out of the bloodstream into the tissues, and then carbon dioxide goes the opposite direction. We can see that this hemoglobin molecule inside the red blood cells is allowing the oxygen to move out of the hemoglobin, out of the red blood cell into the capillary and then into the tissues. As carbon dioxide begins to build up in the bloodstream, carbonic anhydrase then converts it into bicarbonate, and most of that carbon dioxide is carried as bicarbonate through the bloodstream. So the second thing that we want to talk about today is what are some things that can go wrong with the respiratory system. So we'll talk a little bit about health, and many of these things you've experienced or have heard of. Sinusitis is where we have a blockage or inflammation of the sinuses, typically caused by a respiratory infection like a cold. We can get an infection of the middle ear. Tonsillitis is where we have inflammation of the tonsils. This is right at the back of the pharynx. Or laryngitis, where we have an infection or inflammation of the voice box, the larynx. And this can even lead to hoarseness or the loss of a voice. You can also have in the lower respiratory tract things like pneumonia, where the lungs themselves become infected and a very thick fluid builds up. People with pneumonia have a very distinctive, rattly, wet cough. Tuberculosis is where a bacterial infection leads to tubercles, or these encapsulated bacteria in the lungs. Tuberculosis isn't as common now, although it still exists, but back in the 1800s, it was really common. Then we have pulmonary fibrosis, and this is where the lungs lose some elasticity because of this connective tissue buildup. It's usually because of inhaled particles like asbestos. Some people will develop emphysema. This is a chronic, incurable disorder in the alveoli, and so they become damaged, and the surface area for gas exchange is significantly reduced. People with emphysema frequently have to use oxygen in order to supplement their gas exchange. In asthma, the bronchial tree periodically becomes quite irritated and swells, and then it makes it harder for gases to be exchanged. It causes people to feel very breathless. Wheezing and coughing can also be a symptom of an asthma attack. And then we can have lung cancer, which is where you have uncontrolled cell division in the lungs that often is caused by smoking or other inhaled particles. And here we can see some of the locations where that would occur. Bronchitis, we just have an inflammation of the bronchioles, typically due to an infection or an infection that causes lots of coughing that will lead to this inflammation of the bronchioles, and they will often get mucus buildup. Asthma is where the bronchioles constrict or swell. Emphysema, we can see damage to the alveolar sacs. Pulmonary tuberculosis, this is where we get those encapsulated bacterial cells clogging up the alveoli. Asbestos and other irritants can get lodged in the alveoli, which then cause these fibrous tissues to build up, reducing lung capacity. And then we have pneumonia, where the infection becomes so great that pus and fluid begin building up inside those alveoli sacs, making it very difficult to breathe. And that finishes our notes for Chapter 10. Thank you, guys.